The transport ship cut through the Atlantic waters like a blade through silk, carrying within its hold hundreds of German soldiers who had surrendered in North Africa, their uniforms still stained with desert sand, their eyes hollow with the weight of defeat. Among them was Friedrich Müller, a 23-year-old corporal from a small village near Munich, who pressed his face against the porthole and watched the endless gray waves, wondering if he would ever see his homeland again. The stories had circulated among the prisoners during their weeks at sea, whispered tales of what Americans did to captured Germans, rumors that grew more terrible with each retelling, fed by years of propaganda that had painted the enemy as barbaric and merciless. Friedrich had believed those stories once, had carried them like armor through the campaigns in France and the burning deserts of Tunisia. But now, stripped of his weapon and his certainty, he felt only the gnawing emptiness of fear and the sharp ache of homesickness that came in waves stronger than the ocean beneath them. His younger brother Hans was somewhere on the Eastern Front, and his mother's last letter, received months ago, had spoken of bombings in Munich, of neighbors lost, of bread rationed to nothing. The war that had seemed so righteous, so necessary in 1939, now felt like a machine that devoured everything it touched, leaving only ash and broken men in its wake. When the ship finally docked in Norfolk, Virginia, the prisoners were herded onto trains, and Friedrich caught his first glimpse of America through the barred windows. The landscape rolled past in shades of green he had almost forgotten existed, so different from the scorched earth of North Africa. Children waved from farmhouses, not with hatred but with curiosity, and he felt a strange dislocation, as if the world he had been told about and the world he was witnessing were two entirely different places. The train carried them westward for days, through landscapes that seemed impossibly vast, until finally they arrived in Texas, in a place called Camp Huntsville, where the summer heat felt like stepping into an oven and the sky stretched endless in blue. The camp itself was a sprawl of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fences, watchtowers at each corner, guards with rifles who watched but did not seem eager to use them. Friedrich and the others were processed, given clean uniforms, assigned to barracks, and then something unexpected happened. They were served a hot meal, real food, more than they had eaten in months. Meat, potatoes, bread that was fresh and soft, and coffee that was actually coffee. Friedrich sat at the long wooden table, his hands trembling as he ate, unable to reconcile this moment with everything he had been told to expect. Around him, other prisoners ate in stunned silence, their eyes meeting occasionally, reflecting the same confusion, the same cautious disbelief. That first night, lying on a cot that was surprisingly comfortable, Friedrich listened to the sounds of Texas through the thin walls. Cicadas singing their endless song, the distant howl of a coyote, voices in English that were sometimes harsh but often carried laughter. He thought of his brother, wondered if Hans was lying in some muddy trench on the Eastern Front, freezing and starving, while Friedrich had clean sheets and a full stomach. The guilt was crushing, but so was the relief, and he hated himself for feeling both. The morning brought work assignments. Friedrich was sent to a cotton farm 20 miles from the camp, along with 30 other prisoners and 2 guards who introduced themselves as Joe and Robert. Joe was from Oklahoma, a farmer himself before the war, with weathered hands and a slow smile. Robert was younger, maybe 19, nervous and trying to hide it behind a stern expression that kept cracking. They loaded into trucks and drove through the countryside, and Friedrich pressed his face to the window again, watching this strange new world unfold. Farmhouses with wide porches, fields that stretched to the horizon, a completely different vision of abundance than the scarred landscape he had left behind. The farmer who owned the land was a man named Vernon Hastings, tall and lean with skin tanned to leather by decades under the Texas sun. He looked at the prisoners with curiosity rather than hatred, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "I need workers," he said simply. "You work hard, I'll treat you fair. That's all there is to it." Friedrich and the others were put to work picking cotton, and the labor was brutal under the relentless sun, but Vernon brought them water regularly, cold from a well, and at midday he provided lunch that was more generous than it needed to be. Sandwiches thick with meat, fruit that was fresh and sweet, and occasionally, inexplicably, chocolate bars that the men devoured like children. Weeks passed, and a rhythm established itself. Wake before dawn, truck to the farm, work until sunset, return to camp. the guards Joe and Robert became familiar presences, not exactly friends but not cruel either. Joe taught them words in English, laughing at their attempts at pronunciation, and Robert gradually relaxed, showing them photographs of his girlfriend back home, a pretty girl with dark curls who smiled at the camera. Friedrich found himself laughing for the first time in months, surprising himself with the sound. One evening, after a particularly long day in the fields, Vernon invited the prisoners to sit on his porch while he prepared what he called a barbecue. Friedrich had never seen anything like it. Vernon had dug a pit and filled it with wood, and now a whole side of beef was slowly cooking over the embers, filling the air with smoke and the most incredible smell Friedrich had ever encountered. Vernon's wife, Mary, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, brought out potato salad and beans and cornbread, and when Vernon declared the meat ready, he carved thick slices and handed them out to everyone, prisoners and guards alike, no distinction made. Friedrich took his first bite and felt something break open inside him. The meat was tender and smoky and seasoned with spices he didn't recognize, and it was perhaps the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, but more than that, it was the kindness of the gesture, the casual humanity of it, that unmade him. He found tears running down his face, which he tried to hide, but Mary saw and simply handed him a napkin and patted his shoulder. "It's all right, son," she said quietly. "It's been a hard war for everyone." That night, sitting on Vernon's porch under a sky full of stars, one of the other prisoners, a man named Klaus who had been a teacher before the war, pulled out a harmonica he had somehow kept through all the chaos and began to play. The notes drifted out into the warm Texas night, a folk song from Bavaria that Friedrich recognized from his childhood, and soon others were humming along, their voices joining together in harmony. Vernon and Mary sat listening, and Joe the guard leaned back in his chair with his eyes closed, and for a moment the war seemed very far away, as if it belonged to another world entirely. The weeks became months, and summer faded into fall, bringing cooler temperatures and a softening of the harsh landscape. Friedrich wrote letters home when paper was available, carefully worded to pass the censors, trying to tell his mother that he was alive and well without revealing too much about where he was or what his days looked like. He didn't know if the letters ever reached her, and at night he prayed that she was safe, that Hans was alive, that somehow their family would survive this madness intact. The other prisoners came from all corners of Germany and occupied Europe. There was Otto, a giant of a man from Hamburg who had been a dock worker and still moved with the rolling gait of someone used to ship decks. There was Dieter, quiet and intense, who had been studying medicine before the war and now spent his evenings trying to maintain his knowledge by reading any medical texts he could borrow from the camp library. There was young Peter, barely 18, who had been conscripted in the final desperate days before surrender and still had nightmares that woke the entire barracks. They formed a strange community, these defeated soldiers in a foreign land, bound together by shared language and circumstance but also by the gradual realization that their survival depended on adaptation. Some remained bitter, clinging to ideology even in captivity, but most, like Friedrich, found themselves slowly letting go of certainties they had once held as absolute truth. The Americans they encountered daily were not the monsters of propaganda. They were farmers and shopkeepers and young men far from home, ordinary people caught up in the same vast machinery of war. Vernon's farm became a sanctuary of sorts. The old farmer had a way of treating the prisoners not as enemies but simply as men who needed work and purpose. He told stories while they labored in the fields, tales of his own father's journey from Tennessee to Texas, of droughts and hard years and the resilience required to coax life from stubborn soil. He asked about Germany, curious about their lives before the war, and he listened without judgment when they spoke of home. His questions opened doors in Friedrich's memory that he had kept locked, and he found himself describing his village, the small bakery his family had run for generations, the way the church bells sounded on Sunday mornings, the taste of his mother's apple strudel. Mary often sent food back to the camp with them, homemade pies or jars of preserves, gestures that seemed impossibly generous to men who had spent years in scarcity. The guards would pretend not to notice, would sometimes share in the bounty themselves, and gradually the walls between prisoner and keeper became less solid, more permeable. One evening, Robert confessed to Friedrich that he had cousins in Germany, second-generation immigrants who had settled in Wisconsin, and that his grandmother still spoke German at home. "I keep thinking," Robert said, his young face troubled, "that if things had been different, if I'd been born there instead of here, I might be the one behind the wire." The camp commander was a man named Colonel Thompson, a career officer who ran the facility with firm efficiency but also with an unexpected streak of humanity. He instituted educational programs, allowing prisoners to take classes in English, mathematics, agriculture, trades that might serve them when the war ended. He organized a camp newspaper, printed in German, where prisoners could share news and poetry and essays. He permitted musical performances, and soon a camp orchestra formed, instruments donated by local churches and civic organizations, and on Saturday evenings the sounds of Beethoven and Brahms floated out across the barbed wire into the Texas twilight. Friedrich joined the orchestra as a violinist. His father had taught him as a child, insisting that music was essential to a cultured life, and though Friedrich's fingers were calloused now from farm work, they remembered the shapes of the chords, the pressure of the strings. Playing again felt like coming home to himself, to a part of his identity that the war had tried to erase. During rehearsals, the men shed their prisoner identities and became musicians again, focused entirely on the beauty they could create together. Otto played the tuba with surprising delicacy, and Dieter conducted with the precision he had once applied to anatomy, and young Peter discovered he had a gift for the clarinet that made his face shine with joy. The local community began attending the concerts, families from Huntsville driving out to the camp on Saturday evenings, sitting on blankets outside the fence while the prisoners played. At first, Friedrich found this surreal and uncomfortable, performing for people whose country he had been fighting against, but gradually he came to appreciate the symbolism of it, the way music transcended the boundaries that war had imposed. After one particularly moving performance of Mozart's Symphony No. 40, an elderly woman approached the fence with tears streaming down her face. "My son is in France," she said to the guard, who translated for Friedrich. "I don't know if he's alive. But hearing that music, I remembered why we have to believe in beauty, in what's worth saving." Winter came to Texas, milder than German winters but still cold enough to require jackets and extra blankets. Christmas approached, and the prisoners wondered how they would survive the holiday so far from home, but Colonel Thompson organized a celebration that took them by surprise. A tree was erected in the camp square, decorated with ornaments made by prisoners and guards together. Local churches donated gifts, small things but meaningful: socks, books, writing paper, harmonicas, chess sets. On Christmas Eve, the orchestra performed a concert of carols, both German and American, and the voices of guards and prisoners mingled together singing Silent Night in two languages simultaneously. Vernon and Mary invited Friedrich and several others to their farm for Christmas dinner, a gesture that required special permission but which Colonel Thompson granted. The farmhouse was warm and filled with the smells of roasting turkey and pine from the tree in the corner. Mary's children were there, a daughter with her husband and two small children who stared at the German prisoners with wide eyes until Friedrich smiled and showed them a card trick his grandfather had taught him, and then they laughed and begged for more. The meal was abundant, almost overwhelming, and afterward Vernon produced a bottle of whiskey and poured small glasses for everyone. To absent friends, he toasted, and Friedrich thought of Hans and his mother and his father who had died before the war, and he raised his glass with the others, German and American, all of them bound by loss and hope in equal measure. In the new year, 1945, rumors began circulating through the camp about the war's progress. The prisoners had limited access to news, but enough filtered through to paint a picture of Germany's collapse. The Rhine crossed, cities falling, the Red Army advancing from the east. Friedrich felt a complicated tangle of emotions: relief that the war might end soon, dread about what defeat would mean for his country, crushing worry about his family's fate. At night, he lay awake imagining the worst: his mother trapped in rubble, Hans frozen in some trench, everything he had known reduced to ash. The work continued, providing structure and distraction. Spring came, and with it the endless labor of planting season. Friedrich's hands, which had once been smooth from working in a bakery, were now permanently calloused, his skin darkened by sun, his body lean and strong from physical labor. He barely recognized himself when he caught his reflection in windows. This man he had become, neither quite the soldier he had been nor the baker's son from before the war, but something else entirely, something shaped by survival and unexpected kindness. News arrived in May that Germany had surrendered. The prisoners gathered in the camp square, where Colonel Thompson read the official announcement, and Friedrich felt the world tilt beneath him. It was over. They had lost. Everything they had fought for, believed in, sacrificed for, had come to nothing. Around him, men reacted differently. Some wept openly, some stood stone-faced, some actually looked relieved. Friedrich felt numb, unable to process what this meant for his future. Would they be sent home? Would there even be a home to return to? What would become of them? In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the camp shifted subtly. The guards seemed more relaxed, the prisoners more contemplative. The war was over, but they were still here, still confined, still uncertain about what came next. Vernon, during one of their work days, put his hand on Friedrich's shoulder. "I know this is hard," he said. "Not knowing what happens next. But you've got skills now, you've learned English, you've shown you can work hard and be trusted. Whatever comes, you'll make it through." Summer brought a visit that changed everything for Friedrich. A representative from the International Red Cross came to the camp with news about German civilians, and Friedrich was called to the office to receive information about his family. His heart hammered as he walked across the compound, terrified of what he might learn. The representative, a Swiss man with kind eyes and excellent German, told him that his mother was alive, living in the ruins of Munich with neighbors, struggling but surviving. And Hans, his brother Hans, was also alive, recovering from wounds in a British hospital, expected to make a full recovery. Friedrich walked out of that office and collapsed against a building, sobbing with relief so profound it felt like being reborn. Otto found him there and simply sat beside him, this huge man who understood without words what this moment meant. When Friedrich could finally speak, he said, "They're alive. They're both alive." And Otto smiled, tears in his own eyes, and said, "Then there's something to go home to." The months that followed were strange and liminal, a period of waiting as the world slowly began to reorganize itself. The prisoners remained in the camp, though restrictions gradually loosened. Some were transferred to other facilities, some began the slow process of repatriation, but it would be years before everyone could return home. Friedrich continued working at Vernon's farm, and the old man made him an offer one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the fields. "When you go home," Vernon said, "and you get things sorted out there, if you ever want to come back to Texas, there's a place for you here. I could use a good manager, someone who understands the work and the land." Friedrich was stunned. "You would hire a German? After everything?" Vernon looked at him steadily. "I'd hire a good man who's proven himself. The war's over, son. We can choose to keep hating, or we can choose to build something better. I'm too old and too tired for hate." The offer stayed with Friedrich, a seed planted in fertile ground. He wrote to his mother about it, and her response, when it finally came months later, was encouraging. "The world is changing," she wrote. "We must change with it. Whatever choice you make, I will support it. I only want you to be happy and safe." In the fall of 1946, Friedrich was finally scheduled for repatriation. The day before his departure, Vernon and Mary threw a farewell barbecue at the farm, inviting all the prisoners who had worked there over the years and all the guards who had supervised them. It was a beautiful Texas evening, warm and clear, and the smell of smoking meat filled the air once again. Joe the guard, who had become something like a friend, presented Friedrich with a gift, a small book of Texas poetry and a letter of reference vouching for his character and work ethic. "You're a good man, Friedrich," Joe said, shaking his hand firmly. "Don't forget that, no matter what you face when you get home. You're a good man." Mary hugged him, tears in her eyes, and pressed the package into his hands. "For your mother," she said. "Some pecans from our trees, and a few other things. Tell her we've been taking care of her boy." Vernon walked him to the truck that would take him back to camp one last time. "You know where to find us," he said simply. The offer stands. You'll always have a home here if you want it. Friedrich returned to Germany in early 1947, traveling by ship across an Atlantic that was now peaceful, arriving in a country that was broken and occupied and struggling to survive in the ruins. Munich was devastated, whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, people living in cellars and bombed-out buildings, food scarce, the currency worthless. He found his mother in a refugee shelter, aged beyond her years but alive, and they held each other and wept. Hans arrived a week later, thin and scarred but smiling, and their reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking, 3 survivors trying to piece together what remained of their family. They tried to rebuild the bakery, but it was impossible in the chaos of those early post-war years. There was no flour, no fuel, no equipment that hadn't been looted or destroyed. Friedrich worked odd jobs, labored in reconstruction crews, stood in lines for rations, and slowly came to a decision. His mother saw it in his eyes before he spoke it. "You want to go back," she said, not a question but a statement. "I think I have to try," Friedrich said. "There's nothing for us here right now, Mother. Maybe in a few years, when things stabilize, but right now we're just surviving, barely. In Texas, I could work, send money, maybe eventually bring you and Hans there if you wanted. Vernon's offer is real. He means it." His mother touched his face, the way she had when he was a child. "You found something there," she said. "I can see it in your letters, hear it in your voice. You found a reason to believe the world could be good again. Go, my son. Build something worth having. We'll be all right." In the spring of 1948, Friedrich Müller boarded a ship bound for America, this time not as a prisoner but as an immigrant with a visa and a job waiting for him. The crossing was different this time, no longer filled with fear and uncertainty but with hope and possibility. When he arrived in Texas and took a bus to Huntsville, Vernon and Mary met him at the station, and Vernon shook his hand like an old friend. "Welcome home," he said, and Friedrich realized that he meant it, that this could actually be home, that he could build a life here in this strange and generous land. He worked hard on Vernon's farm, learning not just agriculture but the business side of it, and over the years he became Vernon's partner, then eventually took over when the old man retired. He brought his mother to Texas in 1952, and she lived with him until her death in 1965, happy in her final years, tending a garden and baking strudel for the neighbors. Hans visited several times but ultimately stayed in Germany, rebuilding his own life there, and the brothers remained close despite the distance, writing letters and calling on holidays. Friedrich married a local woman named Sarah, a schoolteacher with a kind heart and a sharp mind, and they had 3 children who grew up speaking both English and German, who learned both American pragmatism and German precision, who were taught that kindness matters more than nationality. He taught them about the war, not glorifying or hiding from it, but explaining honestly what he had learned, that propaganda can blind you, that enemies are often just people on the other side of a line drawn by history, that cruelty is a choice and so is compassion. In the summers, he still prepared barbecues the way Vernon had taught him, inviting neighbors and friends and anyone who needed a meal and community. He told stories about his time as a prisoner of war, not as a tragedy but as an unexpected gift, the strange grace he had encountered when he expected only punishment. His children would listen, fascinated by this chapter of their father's life that seemed almost mythical, and he would remind them that the capacity for good exists even in the darkest times, that music and barbecues and simple human kindness can build bridges across chasms that seem impossible to span. Otto settled in Chicago, working in construction and raising a large family. Dieter became a doctor, eventually returning to Germany to practice medicine in Hamburg. Young Peter stayed in America, moving to California and becoming a high school music teacher, never forgetting how the clarinet had saved his soul in a prison camp in Texas. They stayed in touch over the years, these men who had been prisoners together, reuniting occasionally, their friendship forged in that strange crucible of captivity and unexpected kindness. Joe the guard and Friedrich remained friends for life. Joe went back to farming in Oklahoma after the war, and he and Friedrich would visit each other's farms, sharing techniques and jokes and memories. They appeared together on a television documentary in the 1970s about prisoner of war camps, 2 old men laughing about how they had expected to hate each other but had instead found friendship. "The war taught us to kill," Joe said in that interview. "But peace taught us to live." Which lesson mattered more? As Friedrich grew old, his children sometimes asked him if he ever regretted the path his life had taken, if he wished things had been different. He would think carefully before answering, because the truth was complicated. He regretted the war, the waste and death and suffering it had caused. He regretted the years stolen from his youth, the trauma that never fully healed, the friends who had died in deserts and trenches for nothing. But the life he had built afterward, the family he had raised, the land he had tended, the friendships he had forged across the boundaries of former enmity, these things he could not regret. "I expected punishment," he would tell them. "I expected cruelty and hatred, because that's what I had been taught to expect. But instead, I found music and barbecues. I found people who chose to see me as human even when it would have been easier to see me as enemy." That choice, that simple human choice to extend kindness instead of cruelty, it changed everything. It changed me. And it taught me that even when the world is at its darkest, even when we've been taught to hate, we can choose something better. We can always choose something better. On warm Texas evenings, when the cicadas sang their endless song and the sky turned orange and purple over the flat horizon, Friedrich would sit on his porch with Sarah, holding her hand, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, and he would remember. He would remember the transport ship and the fear, the first sight of barbed wire, the first taste of Vernon's barbecue, the first notes of music in the camp square. He would remember how broken he had been, how certain he was that his life was over, and how wrong he had been. He would remember Mary's gentle hand on his shoulder, Otto's quiet strength, young Peter's transformation through music, Hans's survival against all odds. And he would think about all the moments when history pivots not on the decisions of generals or politicians but on the small choices of ordinary people, to share a meal, to teach a word, to listen to a story, to see the human in the enemy. These were the moments that mattered, the ones that built bridges and healed wounds and made possible futures that had seemed impossible. The story of Friedrich Müller and the thousands of other German prisoners who spent the war in Texas camps is not widely known, but it deserves to be remembered. Not because it erases the horrors of that war, or excuses the evil that was done, but because it reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, light persists. That even when we have been taught to hate, we can learn to love. That enemies can become friends, that strangers can become family, that forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible. In the end, what saved Friedrich was not just the material kindness he received, though that mattered. It was the recognition in the eyes of people like Vernon and Mary and Joe, the recognition that said, "You are human, you matter, you deserve dignity regardless of what uniform you wore or what army you served." That recognition, that fundamental affirmation of shared humanity, was the bridge that carried him from the ruins of his old life to the foundation of a new one. The barbecues continued for decades, a tradition passed down through Friedrich's family. His grandchildren learned to prepare the meat the way their grandfather had been taught, and they invited neighbors and friends and strangers, continuing the legacy of hospitality and inclusion that Vernon had modeled and Friedrich had embraced. At these gatherings, people would ask Friedrich about the war, and he would tell them truthfully, "I learned that you defeat hatred not with more hatred, but with something stronger. You defeat it with music, with food, with the stubborn insistence on seeing the humanity in everyone, even when it's hard, even when history says you shouldn't." Friedrich Müller died in 1995, at the age of 73, surrounded by family and friends, in the home he had built on land he had learned to love. His funeral was attended by hundreds, German and American, old and young, people whose lives he had touched with his story of transformation. They sang hymns in 2 languages, and someone played the violin in his honor, and they told stories about his kindness and his wisdom and his insistence that the world could be better than it was. On his gravestone, his family inscribed a simple message in both German and English: "He came expecting punishment but found grace. He never forgot, and he taught us to choose kindness." It was a fitting epitaph for a life that had been shaped by the unexpected mercy he received as a young prisoner of war in Texas, a life that became a testament to the possibility of redemption and transformation even after the darkest chapters of history. The camp at Huntsville is gone now, the barracks torn down decades ago, the land repurposed for other uses. But the memory remains, carried forward by the families of those prisoners and guards who shared that strange time, by historians who study the surprisingly humane treatment of Axis prisoners in America, by anyone who hears the story and recognizes in it something essential about human nature, that we are capable of terrible cruelty, yes, but also of extraordinary compassion, and that which side we choose matters more than any circumstance of birth or nation. Friedrich's daughter, speaking at a commemoration ceremony 50 years after the war's end, said something that captured the essence of her father's experience. "My father came to America in chains, a defeated enemy soldier expecting to be treated as his propaganda had promised. Instead, he found people who refused to let war define their humanity. They fed him, taught him, included him, and in doing so, they didn't just save his life, they restored his faith in human goodness. He spent the rest of his life trying to pay that forward, trying to be for others what Vernon and Mary and Colonel Thompson had been for him. That's the legacy of those years, not the victory of one side over another, but the victory of human decency over hatred." And so the story comes full circle, from that young man on a transport ship crossing the Atlantic in fear, to an old man at peace on a Texas porch, to the memory carried forward by those who came after. It is a story about war, but more importantly, it is a story about the aftermath of war, about the choices we make when the shooting stops, about whether we will perpetuate cycles of hatred or break them with acts of unexpected grace. In a world that often seems determined to divide us by nation, race, religion, and ideology, the story of Friedrich Müller and the German prisoners in Texas offers a different possibility. It suggests that bridges can be built even across the widest chasms, that enemies can become friends, that kindness is never wasted, that music and barbecues and simple human connection can heal wounds that seem unhealable. It reminds us that we are all, ultimately, just people trying to survive and find meaning in a complicated world, and that recognizing our shared humanity is the first step toward creating a world worth living in. The music still plays, carried forward by the descendants of those prisoners and guards who made the choice to see each other as human. The barbecues still smoke, their aroma a reminder of generosity and welcome. And somewhere in Texas, on warm evenings when the cicadas sing, you can almost hear the echoes of that first concert in the prison camp, those German voices blending with American ones, creating harmony where there had been only discord, proving that beauty can emerge from the darkest times if we have the courage to create it together.